case study, but absolutely packed with quite provocative and thoughtful comments. I'm sure our discussants have got a lot of thoughts already that they're thinking of saying. I mean, the main thing that springs to my mind is this real challenge to the conventional wisdom that micro-enterprises are the key way, one of the key ways, especially in urban areas but also in rural areas, out of poverty. And I think Milford brought out some really, like you said, logical and sensible challenges to that, and it would be very interesting to hear what our panellists have to say on that. My experience in Medellin, and it's anecdotal, it's my experience, just as I haven't researched it, is that while security has improved massively in the last 10 years, although it possibly got a bit worse recently, poverty is persistent. And so it does that reality in the poor areas of Medellin does suggest that there are some serious thinking has to take place over the current policies. I'm also very interested, actually, in something you don't. I very much recommend that you read the piece, but something you don't pick up on is the relationship between the urban and the rural economy, which is absolutely crucial in Colombia, I'm sure in all countries, and it may be something also that our discussants might want to talk about. Before I ask Kate to speak, can I just check, Malcolm, do we have online people over in Colombia? Oh, good. Okay, hello, Colombia. Hola, Colombia. So I'd like to introduce Kate Maclean, who is a lecturer in human geography at King's College London, a feminist geographer working on livelihoods, especially in Latin America and West Africa. Apart from gender and the informal economy, she works on microfinance, contraband, community economies, especially in rural and peri-urban areas. So maybe you might have some comments on that question that I just posed.
Slide. Yes.
Over to you.
Okay, well, I'm Kate Maclean. My focus is on gender and development. That's where my teaching and research lies. And I've worked in Bolivia mostly, but most recently in Colombia with Milford, looking at how women earn their livelihoods, mostly in the informal sector. So I've done a lot of work, as Jonathan said, on micro-enterprise and also the informal sector in terms of contraband as well. And my particular interest when I accompanied Milford to Medellin was in this transition from the focus on the micro-enterprise to the small, medium-sized enterprise and the general scaling up that was visible certainly in the attitude of the policies of the people that we spoke to in Medellin, and is also more broadly where Latin America is moving towards. And if I can just quote my neighbour Milford here, he emphasised as well that the Inter-American Development Bank has recognised that maybe micro-enterprise and the informal sector, that has really been the focus of development policies, particularly in Latin America for the last 2 decades, maybe is not the best way to invest money to promote equitable development. Yeah? As very much reflecting Milford's argument that they're low productivity micro-enterprise and tend to be self-employed units. Yeah? Now, from the gender perspective, focusing on how women earn a living, this is kind of good and bad. Yeah? The informal sector, and particularly in Ananda Soto's work, tended to romanticize, in my opinion, some of the hardships of the informal sector, and the fact that the increasing emphasis on the informal sector tended to lead to the flexibilization of labor. It was part of that whole argument. Yeah? Having said that, it showed, like on that continent and elsewhere as well, a lot more women entered the workforce at the same time. So those were opportunities that women could take. And women dominate the informal sector. Across the globe, more than 50% of the informal sector is women's work. Yeah? So what does this shift from a focus on micro-enterprise in the informal sector to a focus on more formal enterprises with a broader outreach and a greater scale mean for women? It might mean that informal sector activity is getting kind of a channel into the more formal sector with greater social protection, etc. Or it might mean that some women are going to be left behind in that transition because there are reasons why women dominate the informal sector and hit glass ceilings, encounter leaky pipes, however you want to put it, at various stages when entering the formal sector. Okay. And that's what I want to illustrate with some of the examples that we found in Medellin, is where those barriers lie. Okay. So specifically in Medellin, again, this is these are institutions that Milford was referring to. Social urbanism, I think it's fair to say that the term was coined in Medellin. It's associated with the mayor Sergio Fajardo. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And if you Google social urbanism in English, your first hit is Medellin. Yeah? So it's quite an innovative development strategy, urban development strategy. And it was really predicated, along with many other policies in Latin America that are a reaction to the inequalities that are generally argued to come from the neoliberal period. It emphasizes the social aspects of development, and in particular education, actually, which isn't something that we were focusing on. But education, mass transport systems were in there as well. And also enterprise. Yeah? And part of the social urbanism umbrella was this program called Cultura E, so that's enterprise culture, basically, that emphasized the importance of developing enterprise, not only for the economy, but also violence, which is obviously a big issue in Medellin, would be addressed by promoting enterprise. Yeah. Part of the Cultura E program is the CEDESOS, which we were looking at in particular. And they are, I can't remember what it stands for, Centers of Entrepreneurial Development in particularly excluded zones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And these institutions are set up kind of to facilitate information about credit, about training, about marketing opportunities to people who have an idea for a micro-enterprise or people who have already set up a micro-enterprise and want to take it further. And there's also, I think it's fair to say it's a consortium that, called Pro Antioquia, and that's a group of business leaders who are very concerned that the private sector also contributes to the social urbanism of Medellin, which is very good in terms of like public-private partnerships, and also shows that there is this movement towards scaling up the informal, the micro-enterprise, and making linkages more with the private sector as well. So that quote from the IADB and that kind of sea change, as we put it in our paper, from the micro-enterprise to the small and medium enterprise is already present in the social urbanism of Medellin. And just to specify that, that's the remit of Cultura E. Okay, it's promoted and financed by the mayor of Medellin, and the idea behind it is to boost a culture of entrepreneurialism, which fits with the kind of neoliberal informal sector discourses as well. But the development of new businesses that respond to the needs of the market and regional production chains. So it's fitting in the micro-enterprise, the informal enterprise, into the broader regional development trajectory. Right? And the CEDESOS, their mission is to strengthen entrepreneurial activities, and these are the facilities that they can put you in touch with. So they build business associations, they run courses on how to build that up, either legally or in training on how to do it. Production linkages, market access, that was a very important part of what they did. That was trade fairs, for example, setting up competitions, etc. And also access to credit, training in certain skills and access to credit as well. So that's how they partnered up with the microfinance bank that Milford mentioned as well. Okay. So when we went to the CEDESOS, I found that when I asked the first trainer that we met, well, how many of your clients are women? He said immediately all of them. Almost all of them. I hope that's not my phone. No, okay. Almost all of the clients are women. Yeah, he said that immediately. Women take more risks at the beginning, and it's only when the business starts to grow that the men step in. Yeah. So here's problem number one. Yeah, and that was the first, I didn't prompt him, it was the first thing he said. Yeah. And that's typical. And it's textbook in a sense that, it's interesting that he put it in terms of women taking more risk, because women are generally seen to be risk averse, which I don't think is true. But it's certainly in Anglo kind of culture, it's seen that women are more risk averse. But it's textbook that when the business starts to grow, women tend to take a back seat. Yeah? And the reasons for that, it is generally argued, is that there are gendered barriers to formal employment. Okay? The crucial one, the crucial one overall, I think, is time. Okay? And that is a lot to do with household structure, but women have double, it is argued triple burdens of labour. It's a social construction rather than any kind of natural desire to do this, but women tend to be more responsible for childcare, housework, what's called reproductive labour. They're also more responsible for community labour, maintaining contacts, whether that's within a small community, or whether it's your mum sending the Christmas cards out, whatever it is, women tend to be more responsible for community labour. Yeah? And that is vital. These are vital activities in terms of the economy, but they're not paid, so they're invisible. Yeah. So that double burden of labour, triple burden of labour, means that, as Ruth Lister argues, that when women enter into the formal market, they do so with one hand tied behind their back. Yeah? They're at a structural disadvantage going into the market. And a lot of that is to do with household structure, or presumed household structure, the division of labour within the household, and of course there is a growth in women-maintained households. That was particularly obvious in Medellin, and a lot of these programs were targeting women-maintained households, also called female-headed households, where women were earning the main, were keeping it all together. They were earning the income for the household. And also market structures are gendered. Access to markets is gendered, like whether that's in terms of straight discrimination or in the labour market, or the horizontal division of labour in the the horizontal division of markets, in that some jobs tend to be done by women, some jobs tend to be done by men, and the jobs that are done by women tend to be lower paid. So it might be in your interest to say in the informal sector, because you're going to face those structural constraints going into the formal sector. So those are the reasons why the informal sector is dominated by women, and those are the reasons why the trainer at the CEDESO found that women took more risks at the beginning, and then as soon as the business started to grow, it tended to be men that came in. Yeah? And what I want to emphasize with that is that if you're going to make that change from the micro-enterprise and from the focus on the informal sector and micro-enterprise to more formal employment, then to do it equitably, those gendered barriers have to be taken into account. Right? Which is how hopefully we can get a, I don't want to make too much of a dialectical argument, but we don't want to, go back from before neoliberalism. There was an advantage to that focus on the informal economy. It changed our ideas a little of what counted as economic work. And we need to remember that when we're looking at growing micro-enterprises as well. Okay, so I'll just illustrate this with a couple of case studies from Medellin. Okay. This is I'd say the most successful story that we encountered when we were interviewing people from the CEDESOs who've been supported by the CEDESOs. This was this lady who made ornate spoons. I confess this is not a photo from Medellin, I downloaded that. But she made spoons that were just like that, okay? So she put beads on them, and she bought the spoons, and as she put it, gave it added value by decorating them with the beads, yeah? And they're expensive. The top line of the cutlery set, it wasn't just the 4 spoons, it was a whole set, was retailing at £338, okay? And she was making a nice amount of money. She was making £1,000 per month, which when asked, she said it was about 20 to 30% of that was profit, including her own labour. Okay. So I'd actually be quite happy with that. But that lady was in a particular set of circumstances that meant she'd been able to take advantage of that move from the informal sector to the formal sector. Okay. She was middle-aged, a single woman. She didn't have any children. She didn't have any caring responsibilities that she told us about. She was identified as class 4. The people in the CEDESOs had a ranking, a socioeconomic ranking that went from 0 to 6. And we were in San Javier, which is one of the most excluded, poorest areas. So to be class 4 meant that she was quite the entrepreneurial poor, the right side of poor in a sense. Yeah? She didn't need credit to start her business. She had her own savings. And she also, thanks to the CEDESO, went into a competition for startup companies, and she'd won that competition, and the prize was capital to invest in her business. Yeah. And what she really emphasized was that the training in marketing had helped her, and also the trade fairs that they'd set up, so that she was able to go to certain trade fairs, show her spoons, and through that she'd managed to get contracts with bigger stores in the city. So she had, and she worked to order, but she had enough orders to keep her going and to make a tidy profit. Okay. Now that illustrates something that Milford was saying, is that you can find the people who've managed to do it, yeah? But there are reasons that she was able to make that jump from the micro to the small enterprise that not every woman can, and those are gendered reasons. What made it work was that she was single, so the household structure meant that she had time. She had that initial capital, albeit through a competition, but she wasn't reliant on a loan, so she didn't get trapped in the kind of downward cycle that Milford was returning to. and she'd got the access to the markets. Okay, so in that way, the Sedesor worked for her. What it provided, it worked. However, not every woman is going to be in that position, crucially because they don't have the time. They might have not have the initial capital, and then they won't be able to take advantage of the access to the markets because they won't have the time and the capital to invest in changing that enterprise from a micro to a small enterprise. Now, the solution to that is often seen as women's cooperatives. Yeah, the solution for the women who don't fit that profile. In forming cooperatives, it's seen that you can make economies of scale in terms of the purchasing, so you don't need so much capital. The group can, again, like support each other in their household labour, so you save time. And that seemed to be what a lot of people were saying was the answer to that conundrum in Medellin as well, was that in forming cooperatives or associations, they'd be able to get around that problem. And so we went to see one cooperative. This was just outside Medellin in a peri-urban rural area. Yeah. And this cooperative was set up in 1991, so it had a long history. It had contracts that they made jam. They made fruit-based products. That was jam and sweets. Yeah. They'd been set up for 20 years. They had contracts with big stores that had fallen through, so they kind of had an up and down history. They currently had 18 members, although like that membership waxed and waned with the contracts that they got, as you expect. Yeah. And they currently are supported by the municipality and a certain NGO that had provided them with equipment that really was a dream of a jam making factory. They had about 12 different machines, and they'd managed to get discarded fruit for free, so the primary material was free, and they had a store full of jam and sweets that simply didn't sell. They kept emphasizing our biggest problem is marketing. Okay. And the person I was with when I was doing those interviews had worked a lot with Pro Antioquia, and he took that as the opportunity to really emphasize how important it was to get the private sector involved, because what tends to happen is cooperatives are seen as more the NGO sector in a sense, and where they fall down is that the equipment is there. I think you refer to it as Say's law, in that when you produce something, you're expecting the market will then want it, rather than meeting a market demand. And so that change in focus as well, I think is good. They had the capacity to produce 150 jars of jam a day because of all that machinery, but they hadn't sold any. Yeah? And so what could have worked in terms of in terms of time, in terms of mutual support for reproductive and community labour, was let down with that problem of access to the market. So as I illustrate there, like that's to emphasise the importance of the access to the markets if you're forming a cooperative as well, rather than emphasising the social side, whilst the informal sector would emphasise more the economic side that has to be brought together. Yeah. There's also the importance of rural-urban linkages. One of the other reasons why it hadn't worked out was they didn't have the time to go to Medellin. Also, that's an extra cost in order to sell their product either. And whilst cooperatives are seen as kind of a solution to that conundrum that I was talking about with time and the problem of becoming an standalone entrepreneur, there's also something, the dark side of social capital, like to romanticize the idea of cooperation, particularly between women, to call it solidarity groups, overlooks a lot of tension that can be found in those groups, a lot of competition, and the fact that people just quite often fall out. In the context of Medellin, and certainly in the city, that's extremely difficult because of the history of violence. There's work by Caroline Moser and Kate Maclean that I think illustrates that very well as well. They talk about perverse social capital, yeah, and the relationships have been so difficult in the past, to say the least, that the idea of forming cooperatives is obviously going to be, it will work in certain circumstances, but might not be able to be generalised beyond that. Yeah. And what I'd like to emphasise as well is that whilst there is this emphasis on the failure rate in the informal economy, the high failure rate of micro-enterprise, and how surely it would be better to make those more bigger enterprises, more formal enterprises that create jobs, yeah, I think we need an understanding of how the micro-enterprise fits into people's livelihoods more broadly. As I was sitting with that group of women, yeah, one tried to sell me makeup, yeah, because that was her other sideline that she had. Yeah, standard. I think it's called Herbal Life. It's quite a general kind of pyramid scheme, I think. Another one had bags that she'd made out of recycled material that she was selling as well. They were all talking about the children that they had in Spain and the US who were sending them money. Yeah? So to use Caroline Moser's language, they were managing very complex asset portfolios within which the cooperative played a part. Yeah? Now, that, when I asked people, particularly from Antioquia, how are these people earning a living, that you're wanting to tell how they're earning a living, quite often the response I got was, oh, they're not. Yeah. And I think that illustrates, not every time, yeah, but I think that illustrates that we're forgetting, in this new focus on the formal, we're forgetting the role of the informal sector. Yeah. And that's not going to go away. Okay, it's no longer called the informal sector, in fact, it's informal economies, because that relationship between the informal and the formal is complicated, and they depend upon each other. So in making that shift, whilst it might be good to make that shift from the informal to the small, medium enterprise, I think it has to be remembered that there is still a role for the informal, and it's particularly important for women. Okay. So just to conclude, I'll conclude with a couple of quotes. This is from Jo Beale, who's done a lot of work in Latin America and Africa on gender and urban development. And she's emphasizing that if you want to harness the full complement of human energy and creativity, which I think is clearly what social urbanism is about, yeah, then cities need to be inclusive and welcome diversity. And what that means is keeping a gender disaggregated idea of the key terms which you're working with, specifically the household and the neighborhood. Yeah. And in counting the successes of these programs, you need to keep a gendered count of who's winning and who's losing, because there are gendered factors involved in who is going to be able to make that shift from the informal economy to the small micro-enterprise economy. Yeah. And also, with Martha Chen, who kind of pioneered work on the gender in the informal sector, as she puts it, and particularly with home-based workers, the benefit of Hernandez Soto's work on the informal economy from the feminist point of view and from people who are concerned with gender and livelihoods is that it brought to the economist's tape measure the importance of that sector, the importance to development of the work that goes on in that sector, which is otherwise invisible. Yeah? And her argument is that you need to count that, you need to recognize the importance of it, and that not only changes your idea of how these people earn a living, but it involves changing your idea of what counts as the economic as a whole.